Welcome to Glitch Tech X. How are you, wonderful people? For those of you who are new to the channel, I make videos around gaming and let's plays, PC hardware releases and industry news, along with PC tech discussions and a lot more. So if you are interested in PC gaming and tech discussions, do subscribe to my channel. Okay, so this is the second video in the series of videos we are doing about motherboards. In part 1, we discussed the basics like what is a motherboard, the two major motherboard layouts, and the various motherboard form factors. In this video, we will discuss about all the major things that you should consider while choosing a motherboard. This is a pretty extensive list, so naturally it warranted its own video. Alright, now that we've covered the basics, let's talk about how to choose a motherboard. Now, a lot of people struggle with this. And due to the sheer amount of options available in the market, the confusion is justified. In order to pick the best motherboard that suits your needs, I would suggest that you keep the following things in mind. The first and foremost factor is the budget. The amount of money, moolah, dough, you get the idea, that you can spend on the motherboard, but don't cheap out on the motherboard either. You'll understand this as we go through the list, and a solid reason why not to at the end of the list. Number 2, the type of CPU you're planning to go for, or in other words, the kind of socket defines the type of CPUs you can install. Intel CPUs have different motherboard requirements and socket layouts as compared to AMD, and these boards are not interchangeable, so Intel CPUs are not compatible on AMD sockets and vice versa. Number 3, now that you've chosen the kind of build you want, whether it's Intel or AMD, you'll need to check the compatibility of the socket with the kind of CPU you're planning to use. For the Intel 9th Gen CPUs, you'll need an LGA 1151 V2 socket. But if you're planning to build a 10th Gen Intel based PC, then you'll need an LGA 1200 socket. AMD makes this process a bit less confusing as they use the same AM4 socket for their recent CPUs from Athlons to Ryzen 9s. However, if you're planning to build a high-end workstation using an Intel Core i9 or an AMD Threadripper, you'll need to select an LGA 2066 or TR4 socket motherboard respectively. Number 4, the type of chipset you're planning to choose. Now you would think CPU, socket, and now chipset. What's going on here? What's happening? Well, a socket may support multiple chipsets. For example, the AMD AM4 socket supports multiple chipsets like the B450 or the B550, the X470 or the X570. Even the Intel LGA 1151 socket supports multiple chipsets like the Z390 or the Z370, B360 or H370. Or the Intel LGA 1200 socket that supports the 10th Gen Core series CPUs needs the Intel 400 series chipset to work. And this dependency on the chipset is due to the fact that it manages the flow of data. The chipset governs how peripherals or the components on the motherboard communicate with the CPU, as well as determines if the CPU can be overclocked. There are other factors in play though when we talk about overclocking. The number of RAM slots you need. This would depend on the socket, the size of the motherboard, and the segment it is targeted for. Most motherboards have 4 or 2 DIMM slots, depending on the size of the board. Some might also feature 8 RAM slots, especially in a high-end build like the TR4 for AMD Threadripper or the LGA 2066 for the Core i9s. Number 6, the kind of I/O options you need, like the USB 3 or 3.1 Gen 1 or Gen 2, USB Type-C connectors or Type-A connectors, HDMI or DisplayPort video out, audio file grade audio out ports, etc. Number 7, if you have any space constraints, a small form factor PC would need a mini ITX motherboard. If there are no constraints, you can opt for an eATX motherboard as well. Number 8, expansion slots needed. If you need to connect multiple M.2 drives, the kind of M.2 slots, whether it's SATA or PCIe, the number of GPUs needed, whether you want to build a multi-GPU build. Number 9. Now this point is relevant for the enthusiast. Do you plan to overclock? If so, you need to choose an appropriate motherboard with an appropriate chipset, like the Z300 or Z400 series boards from Intel. Plus, you need a compatible K-series Intel CPU, whereas for AMD, almost every present-day chip is unlocked and can be overclocked on any B-series or X-series board. The A-series boards, like the A320, are an exception. They do not support overclocking. If overclocking is a requirement, then you should also consider the VRM or the voltage regulation module setup of the motherboard. This module is responsible for delivering power to the CPU, so the number of phases, whether a phase doubler is used or not, the quality and amperage of the chokes used, the type and quality of the MOSFETs used are all very important to deliver stable voltage and current to the CPU. Even the thermals of the VRM is important. This in turn is critical in maintaining the stability of the system. This is one of the reasons why you might want to spend more on quality motherboards, as mentioned earlier in the video. Another reason to buy a quality motherboard, in my opinion, is that you rarely change the motherboard. You may change the CPU or upgrade the GPU or RAM during the life cycle of the machine, but a motherboard is only changed if there is a change in the socket or chipset required to support a next-gen CPU, or if you're doing a complete overhaul of the system and starting from scratch. A quality motherboard would also be handy in case you upgrade your CPU. So I would suggest that spend a bit more on the motherboard. I hope this video was informative. If you liked it, click the thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content. Do let me know your thoughts and any other topics that you would like me to cover in this series. That's it for now, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.